Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our speaker series. My name is Kate Gleason. I'm the membership director here, and if you've been before, you know the question I'm going to ask. Any new members in the audience today? Okay, not as many as sometime, but a good number. Well, if this is your first speaker series, welcome. Or if it's your 10th speaker series, we're just so happy to have you. We're also happy to have our partner in this program. If you noticed as you came in, we have the Siteman Cancer Center based at Barnes Jewish Hospital and Washington University School of Medicine. I wanted to make sure I got that right. So they're in the lobby today. They are a generous sponsor of the 2024 speaker series. And good for all of us, they have some great goodies. So I do encourage you, if you haven't stop by on the way out to pick up some of their goodies. Before I talk about, I want to do a plug for next month's speaker series, but before I do that, if you didn't see coming in, and I didn't want to forget to tell everybody, so I brought the sign up here. Today is the spring member open house at the Little Shop around the corner. Our new members might not realize, but the Little Shop around the corner, which is located right at Shaw and Vandevender, is part of the Missouri Botanical Garden, and as such, members receive a discount, your regular member discount of either 10% or 20%, depending on your level of membership. And today they're doing an extra 20% off for members. They've got some refreshments over there and have made sure that their floors are well stocked with all the home goods. So I do encourage a visit if you can. They're open, I think, they're open until 5 p.m. today. So definitely after the program, if you have time to walk or drive over there, I encourage you to do so. And then, like I said, I wanted to, before I bring our chef extraordinaire up, I wanted to do a plug for next month's speaker series because it's going to be a really special one. We met just yesterday with the panel of garden scientists who will be presenting. It's on June 13th. It will be an evening program, so I'm throwing two curveballs at you. It won't be a Tuesday, so it'll be a Thursday, and it'll be at 7 p.m. As you may remember, the garden is open all spring and summer every Thursday night. So we're taking advantage of those evening hours, and on Thursday, June 13th, we'll have a panel on field work. So the work that the garden does in more than 50 countries around the globe. We've picked 3 scientists to talk about the work that they do in Asia, in South America, and in Africa. Also, just what goes into planning field work. What do you pack? What kind of permits do you need to get? What kind of vaccinations do you need to get? But then also, how do you get your equipment over there? And more importantly, how do you get the plant material back here into the country to be able to study and conserve? So it should be a great program. As I said, we met yesterday and they have a lot of stories to share. So I encourage you all to join us for that. Now it is my great pleasure to welcome Rob Connoley to our speaker series stage. Rob is the acclaimed chef and owner of Bulrush restaurant in Midtown St. Louis. His unorthodox approach to cooking has garnered the attention of the Smithsonian, National Geographic, the BBC, and the James Beard Foundation, who recently named Rob a finalist for the 2024 Best Chef Midwest Award. Yes, I agree. We were excited. I think we looked really smart that the timing of this program was timed perfectly with that announcement last month. So kudos to him and us. Rob was born and raised in St. Louis. He earned a doctorate from Purdue University, and he's one of our neighbors here at the garden because he lives in the Shaw neighborhood. Please join me in welcoming Rob.
So the James Beard thing is actually really fun because we've just gone through 3.5 months of judges coming into the restaurant, and they finally stopped a week and a half ago. So for the first time in 3.5 months, my staff and I can relax and serve bad food again. But we couldn't do that during those times. By our count, we had at least 30 judges come in during that time period. Those are the ones that we were able to identify because it is an anonymous process, and I'm just a very good researcher of my guests. We do that of all of our guests. It's because we're fancy like that. You pay me not just for the food, but for me to research your LinkedIn profile. So I'm really happy to be here today. Yes, I do just live a 5-minute walk away, and I've worked so much with the Botanical Garden over the past really 7 or 8 years because we've worked with them before the restaurant even opened. One of the things that I hear often from people who've known me since I've come back to town, which has been 8, almost 9 years now, is they say the things you talked about 5, 6, 7 years ago, that's what you're doing today. And that's true. I'm very bullheaded. Anytime someone says to me, that'll never work, I said, okay, then we're going to do that just to prove you wrong. And we've done that. I wanted to do the history of Ozark food. Why would anyone do that in a restaurant? I wanted to do it in an academic way, but not in a boring academic way. And we've done that. And we've made money doing it, and we've paid off all of our debts and on and on. And so what I want to do today is talk about this. The Botanical Garden was very generous to say I can talk about whatever I want. So that's what I'm going to do. I have a title that they made me submit, but that's not what I want to talk about at all. I actually want to talk about how over the years I've become one of the world authorities on squirrel cooking. And I think that's, well, I know many of you knew this was coming, and because when I do these presentations, people are always asking for recipes for squirrel and how to clean squirrel. And so that's what we're going to focus in on today. I can't do any live demos. They were afraid of any contamination to the plants that might be on the garden grounds, and just the fear of what the squirrels who live on the grounds might have seeing the presentation. But that is what we're going to talk about. So last October was the most recent World Champion Squirrel Cook-Off, and it was in Springdale, Arkansas. I was one of 10 judges. There were 35 different teams. Each team had to provide an entree and a side. The side could be an appetizer, it could be a dessert. And so 35 teams, 2 dishes, that's 70 different types of squirrel that I consumed in one day. These teams had to provide food for the judges in full portions, as well as 600 guests who, 6,000, I don't know. There were a lot of guests who showed up. The terrible parking problems. I think it was 6,000, because what I remember is at the end of it thinking, there are no squirrels in Northwest Arkansas anymore. I don't know how they got that much meat, even just for us judges. I think people will ask, what was your favorite and whatever. The most impressive, and this is for people who know what a filet mignon is the team that provided squirrel filet mignon. That was this big. Okay, now, this is where we separate the chefs from the non-chefs. That's not possible, because squirrel filet mignon should be about this big, but they did it, and if anyone cares, I can explain how. That's why they had a chef on the judging panel versus all the guys with their ball caps with the plastic backings and the big bellies with the overall straps. That was not me. In fact, those judges made fun of me because I had an all-cloth ball cap, and they said, "Oh, what city are you from?" I didn't know that was an insult, but apparently it was. So the teams provided all sorts of amazing food, and people think, well, they must have just done like, I don't know, stews, and no. These were some serious chefs and cooks out there. And we had, my favorite was a khao soi, a Thai coconut soup with squirrel. It did not win. I don't remember what won. I just remember their side dish was a true mincemeat pie. Mincemeat meaning the meat and the fruit, like a traditional mincemeat pie where the meat was squirrel. Now, you know, for us chefy types, mincemeat normally uses suet, that's kidney fat. They didn't do that. I don't think. There probably isn't much fat on a squirrel kidney, but I don't know how they did it, but it was delicious. But one of the interesting parts of that whole trip was I'm a busy guy. You know, I work about 70-hour weeks at the restaurant, and so to get down there for a Saturday event and get back in time for dinner service, I left at 4 in the morning. I was very tired. Raced on down 44. At some point after Springfield, you shoot down a country road to cross into Arkansas. I don't remember highway numbers, but it was a numbered highway. And all of a sudden, before I get to the Arkansas border, it was about 6:30 in the morning at that point, and I see the lights behind me. Now, this is going to be one of the great life lessons that you've ever had, so take notes on this because you'll want to use this. The sheriff comes up and says, with this thick accent, "Sir, do you know why you've been pulled over today?" And I said, I don't, officer. Very sorry. What can I do? And he said, you were going over the speed limit. Where are you heading to today, sir? And I said, well, actually, I'm the judge at the World Squirrel Cook-Off Championship. Oh, my grandpappy used to eat squirrel, and we had squirrel growing up. Yes, I got out of that ticket. So the life lesson here for us city folk is if you get pulled over on a backcountry road in southern Missouri, just say you're heading to be a judge of the World Squirrel Cook-Off Championship. It might work. So the thing about squirrels is it's shocking for a lot of you, I'm assuming. I'm guessing about 2/3 of you can't even imagine eating squirrel, maybe even more. Is there anyone here who has eaten squirrel? Whoa. I'm going to have to go check the grounds and see. Maybe was that for lunch today? Wow. So that is very unusual, and maybe that's why you're here at this particular presentation. I knew that there would be interest in the squirrel recipe, so that's good to see that about 1/3 of the room just raised their hand. The other 2/3 of you, y'all need to get out. I will say, living across from Tower Grove Park, those squirrels are not the ones I eat. They are the fattest of all of them, but those are getting food at places maybe I don't want to enjoy. So I'm glad to see this as an adventurous group, but not everyone is. So I just want to note that there's a lot of different types. Oh, I know it's cute, but with salt and barbecue sauce, it is delicious. It is delicious. And because I don't know if the health department's here, I'm not going to talk about dinners that may not have happened at the restaurant where animals that may not be allowable might have been served. I will say, for those of you who've never been to the restaurant, I would never do such a thing. And typically our meals are more forage-based, meaning plant-based than animal-based. They're cute though, but they do taste good. What's much more common for me as a forager is something like acorns. Now, how many of you have eaten acorns? Isn't that interesting that less of you have eaten acorns than the squirrels that eat the acorns? I guess that means you know how to barbecue versus leach the tannins out of acorns. This is going off message here for just a second, but just yesterday we learned that we secured a grant through St. Louis University. We're doing a chemical nutritional analysis of acorns. I've been wanting to do this for years and years and years because those of you who've done acorns, eaten acorns, most likely you leach the tannins by boiling it. What I teach when I teach classes is to do the cold water overnight method. But what I do in my restaurant is we have a vacuum chamber sealer because we're fancy, and we can do that cold water method sort of as a boil method in just 3 to 5 minutes. And so those 3 techniques, I think, have an impact on the nutritional outcome of acorns, and we got a grant to send it off to a lab finally, and so we're going to get that hypothesis finally answered. What is the most nutritional way to process acorns? And I'm really excited about that. Not that anyone's going to use that information, but it is information that we should know. And I say that because as the environment changes and we reconsider what is food and what isn't food, and acorns will rise again, then we need to know the best way to eat acorns. But that's a whole nother story. So this is the team. This is the dream team that got us the James Beard nomination. And I just want to note that everyone in that picture has done research for me on what is Ozark food. Only 2 of them have cooked squirrel with me because of the turnover of staff. But everyone there does research. The guy in your upper left, that's my dishwasher. And he did 19th century livestock research, looking at what livestock were being brought into the Ozarks in the early days. So we know the first breeds of pigs that were brought in. We know what county the first cattle were brought into. These are things that were important to us as we explored the ultimate question. But let me back up just briefly and say, I'm born and raised in St. Louis. I'm a Bridgeton kid. For my North County folks, I'm a Carrollton, Bridgeton kid, so my house is the runway that never got used. I went to DeSmet, and after DeSmet, I went off to Loyola in New Orleans for my undergrad, and then ultimately Purdue for my doctorate. Skipped the master's if anyone is following the trail there. And then I moved out west. I had a big draw in my life to ski, mountain climb. I'd been in school a long time and I just needed to do something else. And I was trying to be a professional mountain climber at that point, which explains this, I don't know. And so I ended up first in southern Colorado, then southern New Mexico, a little bit of time in Lima, Peru, actually not Lima, but up in the mountains north of Lima, the Huascaran Range. And that's really where I learned to get to where I am today. So back then, I was doing nonprofit work. I became very good at writing big federal grants, and I enjoyed writing grants for a while, for 15 years. My last one was a huge grant to SAMHSA, that's Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, where I opened up a meth treatment program in rural New Mexico while Breaking Bad was on the air. And that's the one where I said, I think I'm finished. and so when I turned 40, it was not a midlife crisis. I said it's time to do something different. And that's when I opened up my first restaurant. That first restaurant was just soup, salad, sandwiches, nothing fancy. But very quickly I became bored of soup, salad, sandwiches and opened up a tasting menu restaurant. For my students of restaurants here, this is a year after Alinea in Chicago opened. This is the first molecular gastronomy restaurant in the nation. We don't call it that now. We call it modernist or something else. But this is a restaurant in Chicago that will take an apple and make it not an apple anymore and then recreate it as an apple that's not an apple. This is what we used to do back then. It was all about impressing people with our science knowledge. And that's what I was doing in the super small remote town in the Gila wilderness of southern New Mexico. That is Apache territory. That's where Geronimo was raised. Geronimo grew up. That's also where Wyatt Earp was the sheriff. I mean, this is old western town. And because of that, I also timed it with when Michael Pollan's Omnivore's Dilemma was released. And I think many of you know that book. Now he's more known for psychedelic mushrooms and the impact on mental health, especially PTSD. But back then he was the one who really pioneered nationally the idea of locavore dining. I know there's people who will correct me, so yes, Alice Waters, California Cuisine, and all that, but Michael Pollan wrote the book, and that's when it really gained popularity. And so I come right after those movements of modernism and locavore dining, and I open up a restaurant. And I do this crazy stuff that has no business being done in such a remote location. And because of Michael Pollan, it's how do I do this ethically in a town that literally is 3 hours to any major city. The closest city, the major city, was Las Cruces, if anyone knows New Mexico. Those are big states out there. And so it was really hard. We had maybe 2 or 3 very small farmers, a bunch of ranchers, a lot of 4-H kids. And so I would source all my animals from 4-H kids. But I had to grow my own food. I put in some greenhouses right away, but I really relied on foraging. I'm getting somewhere with all this background. And so with foraging, I worked with the local Apache folks, and there's also a friend who was Lakota Sioux who happened to retire there. And so I learned my foraging from a more indigenous spiritual perspective. Instead of go out and just grab whatever you want without regard for the plants or animals or the land, you are harvesting with all of that in mind. Okay. So what I created then and has continued and evolved into in a much more intense way here is this idea of using local ingredients in an excessive way. It was much harder in New Mexico. We didn't have as much. We were high desert. Here, I can throw a stone. Well, I can walk across the street and start picking stuff out of the garden. Don't do that. but you could, and there's just food everywhere. A 10-minute drive and I can be on a trailhead full of food. Now, for those of you who are thinking about such things, I don't. I go much further because I have to know the land that I'm harvesting from. But we also work with humanely raised meats. Vegetarians and vegans, my apologies, but for those of you who do consume meat, we work with local farmers only who we know are raising animals in the most ethical way possible, harvesting them in the most ethical way possible. We know our farmers. Most of them are hobby farmers, none of them are industrial farmers, and we only purchase whole animals. The animals we're raising are historical breeds, and we do that because we want to tell the story of what Ozark food is. We also really focus on seasonality. I always love watching other chefs, and they're like, it's asparagus season. And no, it's not. I know you're buying that from Mexico or California because I know the local farmers, and we just got asparagus 3 weeks ago, and you're serving asparagus 5 weeks ago. For us, we're excessive about that. We want it to be the freshest, most seasonal for customers, but also because I want the local economy to be strong. To say you're serving fresh asparagus and have the local farmers throwing asparagus in their compost because it didn't sell, because it's not pretty enough, that's a problem for me. This is very Michael Pollan-esque thinking. The other thing is just leaving the land in better shape than how you found it. That, again, is the indigenous perspective. We do all sorts of things. These pictures will show you. We tap our own maple trees because when I say local sourcing, while I do use a little white sugar as the pastry chef, all local honey, somewhat local sorghum. It comes from Siteman or Springfield, and then, again, tapping our own maple trees and black walnut trees and some other trees. We do a lot of foraging. I'm terrible at morels. The picture you see, that's probably all I've ever found. But I do try every year. But that's the only one I'm not good at foraging. The other picture, if you can make that out, those are maitake or hen of the wood. That day I pulled in 70 pounds in one hike. I've gone back every year and they weren't there. But I've seen the cuttings. Someone else has found them, so they are coming back. The picture in the bottom corner, that's a farm that they're no longer there anymore. They didn't get the support they needed. Those pigs are a breed called mulefoot hogs. All right, why is all this important to me? Well, our modern diet is terrible. When I speak at high schools or colleges, I can throw this up and people are like, oh, Cheetos, I love Cheetos. I'm like, oh, there's nothing nutritious in there. Just because it's orange, that doesn't mean it's got whatever the chemical is in orange vegetables. No, that's all artificial, and I get it. It's salty, and you're addicted, and fried, and you're addicted, and sugar, and you're addicted. Oftentimes I'll say, hey, what's your favorite food? And almost immediately, pizza. Okay, what's your favorite pizza? I'm talking high schoolers, and they'll almost always say Little Caesars. And I say, why? Oh, because the cheese, it also has the highest sugar concentration in the crust, and that's an addictive chemical essentially to your brain. The endorphins get going. But there's hope here in town. There's, in fact, a lot of hope. We are an epicenter of some really amazing agricultural science that's going on. Some of you may know Haru Urban Farms up on the north side. Haru's become a partner of ours. He's one of the recipients of our reparative funds. Hold that thought. We'll get into it in a minute. And he grows historical varieties of squash and melons. We have a seed project, and now he grows our squash and watermelons too. He uses that to feed the north side. And this is a gentleman that came to us, Anthony Brazelton. He works at Bayer, and Anthony specializes in collard greens. His specialty is historic varieties of collard greens. And you're like, oh, that's cool, whatever. But wait, he's a scientist. And he's looking at the heavy metals that each variety pulls out of the ground. Why? Because people on the north side are doing food apartheid work where they're reclaiming vacant lots, doing vacant lot gardening as a way of feeding the community, and community organizers are doing it as a way of developing community leaders and organizers. And to know what varieties of collard greens are the healthiest to be eating is really important, because there are good, better, and best among those. And so Anthony's doing that work and came to talk to us about our seed project. Let me back up one more step, because I'm guessing some of you don't even know where the Ozarks are. And I bet there's a bunch of you who know where the Ozarks are, but you're wrong. because you got to keep up with these things. It changed last year. Did you know that? You didn't think so. It changed 2,000 years ago too. Did you know that? You might have known that one. So what I used to say is the bottom half of Missouri, the top third of Arkansas, with little tidbits of Kansas and Oklahoma. Pretty good answer. Being a little more academic, it's actually a geographic feature. It's a plateau that over the Ice Age has been leveled out. So we don't see it as a plateau, but geologically it is. But when I talk with Professor Natalie Mueller of WashU, who's a paleoethnobotanist, and I do a presentation at the restaurant and say, oh, well, it's the top third and bottom half and blah, blah, blah. And she says, by your timeline it is. As a paleoethnobotanist, when we look 2,000 years ago, actually, it includes parts of Illinois. Why? Because the Mississippi has moved over time. And if you've seen that map, if you've never seen the drawing, the map of the Mississippi movement, you should Google that. It's one of the most beautiful images that I've ever seen. It's just really neat to think about. So parts of Illinois too. But for those of you who knew all of that, last year when the Smithsonian had me to DC doing trainings and presentations, they introduced a new map of the Ozarks. And it's expanded and defined the boundaries a little bit more even. Illinois is now back in it, and some of the other boundaries have changed as well. So if that's of interest to you, just Google the Smithsonian Ozark boundaries. It was a big launch last July. Okay. When you think about food of the Ozarks, I'm not going to have you all yell out right now, because I've done this enough and you have a lot of ideas. And since so many of you have eaten squirrel, maybe you're going to take my thunder away. So typically when I ask in the Ozarks, what is Ozark food? No one really knows. They say, well, living off the land, eating everything, no waste, sustainable eating, lots of hunting, and yes, of course, squirrel and other meats. But there's a lot more to it than that. And I just want to say that no one has answered that question. And if you're looking at me saying, well, come on, 2024, back when we started this project, 2019, no one had answered that question. We work with all the big researchers, like all of them. And they all have said the same thing. No one's done it because no one thought it was of interest, because it's probably just Southern food, because these are people from Appalachia or the South who ultimately migrated in. To which my response is, hold my cup, because we know there's some flora and fauna that is specific to the Ozarks, and this ultimately gets to, that was a long intro, by the way. I think I'm ready to start the presentation now. So ultimately, what we're trying to do at Bulrush is answer the question, what is Ozark cuisine? And to me, we do this arbitrary definition of the food we eat today in the Ozarks. Where did that come from? It would be easy to say, well, indigenous people were there for millennia, eons before, but I need to do a restaurant that is relatable to the modern diner, the contemporary diner. And so we do this arbitrary definition of saying, well, 250, 300 years ago, it's this point in time when the indigenous people first encountered the settlers who often would bring enslaved individuals. Those three cultures bring their cultural backgrounds to an area with specific flora and fauna, and that interaction is what has ultimately evolved into what we eat today in the Ozarks. Okay, that's a pretty good definition that doesn't answer anything. And so how do we do that? Well, back when we first opened, I didn't know. I didn't know what we were doing. We were in the fake it till you make it phase to an extreme. And the first thing I did was like low fruit researching. I went to the public library where they have the city directories. I could flip through the city directories and find businesses that I thought might be interesting. Those of you who have caught that little detail, St. Louis is not in the Ozarks. It was a nice starting point for us. We've since branched out to all the Ozarks and county historical societies. But back then I was going through city directories and I'd find, for example, a seed store. All I had to do then was find the owner of the seed store's name and wait for him to die. And then once they follow me on this. Historically speaking, they die and now all of that goes into their estate record. And I can go to the Secretary of State's archives and pull up that estate record and see not only what was in their personal estate, but their business estate. And that's where I get detail, way more detail than we would get today. I think today, if a seed store went out of business, it would say 50 pounds of seeds. Might break it down a little more. Not back then. It said exactly every single seed and how much of it. So we did the same with our bar work is based on 4 different bar inventories. So we did a lot of this written word documentation. That's only 1/3 of the equation though, right? But we found some really neat stuff. Anyone who's done archive work knows the feeling of holding a 200-year-old document in your hand and seeing the writing. We don't write like this anymore. My staff I can't read their writing. They never learned how to write. They only learned how to text. And back then it's just beautiful. It's artistically beautiful. And we found things like journals, letters, inventories, less fun, but very useful. And even the one in the bottom left, that's the coolest one we ever found. 1820s, some dude, I don't remember his name, had just come in from Boston. He was writing his mom back in Boston. He said, "Mom, I made it. I'm in the area." This was northeast Arkansas, and I've already met a neighbor. It wasn't developed by European standards yet. I met a neighbor and I killed a deer. I'm going to be okay. How cool is that? And so what we think then in the restaurant is, all right, let's work on venison and see how we can develop that in a modern restaurant. But we need to look at the rest of that equation. And so I thought, well, my family's had a cabin down south of St. Genevieve since the 1920s. My family actually moved into St. Gen in the 1820s, part of the German wave of immigrants. And we've had that cabin. This is the potbelly stove I cook on when I go to that cabin. And near there, for people who know the area, is Crown Winery, as well as Charleville and Chalmette and some of the others. But Crown Winery is of interest because growing up, none of those wineries were there. They were all pig farms, maybe corn. Sometimes soybean, but Crown was the first one to go in. And I didn't think much of it, but when I moved back to town 8 years ago, in our cabin we had this mimeographed booklet. Remember mimeographs, the blue ink? How that wasn't huffing or but we all did it. It smelled good. I have fond memories of that smell. I have memories of that smell. And so we had a mimeograph book that was the cemeteries of St. Francis and St. Genevieve counties. And it listed 90-something cemeteries. They were all St. James, St. John, St. Mark, St. Luke, and then all of a sudden, slave cemetery. And there were hand-drawn maps for all of these. And the slave cemetery was at what is now Crown Winery. And I believe the X is under their new barn, new by my family standards. I think that barn's been there, I don't know, 15, 20 years. And so we know there's a slave cemetery. That led me down the path of saying, well, wait a minute, who's Kaufman, Missouri? That's Kaufman, Missouri, if anyone knows. Who's Kaufman, Missouri named after? And it's John Kaufman. John Kaufman, turns out, was the single largest slaveholder in the state of Missouri at that time. This is where we take a weird turn in the history of the restaurant. What do I care about seed inventories at this point when there's something much bigger going on as we try to define what Ozark food is? And so this led me to find the WPA era database of interviews with freed enslaved people. It's out there. It's fascinating work because these are people in the 1920s who had been enslaved, who were still alive, who were interviewed. And those interviews are transcribed in the vernacular. So you can hear the accent, you can hear the way they're speaking. And it's searchable. So I can search Kaufman, Farmington, whatever. And this led us to do a genealogy project. We have 3 individuals that we found that were enslaved on that farm. We did full genealogies of all of them. We have all living descendants. And now we're partnered with the Office of African American Studies at WashU to figure out what to do with this information in a safe, respectful way. Okay. This has led to reparative restauranting, reparations restauranting, and this is not the presentation I want to give today, but anyone who comes into the restaurant, you will hear about this. I think it's important. You don't have to think it's important. I do, and it's what I want to do with my business at this point because the government will never do anything with it. And that's the end of my political speeches, but this is my way of saying the food we eat today has a background. How do we acknowledge it, and how do we celebrate it in an appropriate way? So what that looks like is we give financial support to 2 different individuals that are related to food. We support heavily Normandy High School. If anyone's been catching the stories on NPR or in the paper, we've coached their culinary team the past 2 years. Last year, the student won the state championship. Thank you. And then this year, she won her 2nd state championship. The second one earned her a college scholarship, and now she's going to Johnson Wales Culinary School in the fall because of that win. That's life-changing, and that's really exciting. I'm watching the clock here, and so there's some other notes, whatever. We have worked a lot with the Botanical Garden from day one, even before day one. We really started at the research library, which is cool if you haven't been up there. Their little display, which changes all the time, has some neat stuff. But they always offered to us to do plant identification for foraging or give us history of identification. But we have some other partners here. The picture down the center, does anyone recognize that? That's the new waterway reclamation over at Tower Grove. That was a project they did with the Osage Nation, and we supported that work. What was really cool to me is I ultimately did the lunch when they welcomed the team from the Osage Nation, the elders, to come in and see it before the rest of the public. And that was very nerve-wracking because they had fed me information for years, and here I was serving them based on the information they had shared with me so generously, and I was thankful they asked for recipes at the end because I was afraid it could come off very offensive or as appropriation. The top left, that's Dr. Allison Miller. Allison Miller works at the Danforth Plants Science Center, and she and I work on wild plants as food source, and we're going to talk more about that for a second. Down the bottom left, that just shows the map of the Hopewell tradition, Hopewell culture, 2,500 years ago, more or less, and that's our work with Natalie Mueller and Gail Fritz. I've just given you 2 of my favorite paleoethnobotanists. I probably have 2 more paleoethnobotanist friends than most of you. I actually have 3 of them. It's a weird life that I'm living at this point. With all these wild foods, I just want to show you some of the things we do very briefly. I'm going to flip through these, so just glance at them and you'll see familiar words and the crazy stuff, because if I just go out and gather a cattail and put it on a plate, you're not going to give me money for that. So I have to do some interesting things to it, probably some words you don't recognize. Feel free to ask that when we get to the Q&A here in a minute. We do a lot with misos. We call them misos. They're really amino acids, but that doesn't sound quite as yummy. So these are misos to us. A lot with the bar and on and on. But I've mentioned a few times this seed project. Find a seed store, guy dies, I get his inventory, and for 5 years now we've been growing back crops based on that inventory. If you look closely, this is actually a sequence of things from there, 3 different carrot slides. And if you look at the name on the beige picture, I don't have my glasses close enough to alter him, but then look at the spelling of it in the printed part where it's a little bit different. This is the detective work that we got to do in this process. It's been a lot of fun. And all of our work is shareable, so if anyone gets excited about this, just email me and I can share our Google Docs and Google Sheets, especially the seed project. There's 95 seeds that were on that inventory. 70 of them we don't really care about because you get those through burpees. It's the other 25 that get exciting for us. Of the 25, 23 are back in the area being grown. That's pretty cool. When we did that, that got the attention of Seed Saver Exchange, who says, wait, this is cool. Thanks for sharing that. Here's some more that you should know about. Things with family provenance. In fact, just today, someone brought me a tomato plant that has family provenance 100 years back in the Ozarks. We get this all the time, and this is rebuilding the history and culture of food in the Ozarks. Here's just some of our partners specific to the Botanical Garden. Of course, the library, as I mentioned, the museum. We've done 2 different projects with the museum. One was liquor and one was potatoes. I think potatoes were the first one. That was an odd one, but it was fascinating. And I've done a number of presentations here as well, the smaller classes. We have done events out at Shaw and showing people foraging, which, again, don't forage out there. We just do it for educational purposes and work with some of the scientists here at the garden. The most recent is Robbie Hart. He's one of the presenters at next month's. And Robbie started a new project cataloging edible Ozark plants. And it was incredibly an honor to have him come to us to start that project, because we had amassed this amazing library of historic Ozark cookbooks, anyway, just documents. And so he started there before they started doing the field work. I'm so sorry if you really did expect squirrel recipes. I can provide those later, but I do want to stop to allow you to ask questions. So first, thank you, don't plunge it. Let's just do some Q&A.
Okay, we do have some time for questions, so I will run the mic. So if I see your hand, I'll get to you, and I'm going to start right here, and then Martha, I'll get you next.
Loved your presentation. I wondered about, seafood, fish, the lakes, streams, ponds, rivers.
I love that question because I'm not an academic journal, I'm a restaurant, okay? Even though I do have the training, I am an evolving project. And I say that because when we first opened, we only served catfish and walleye. And a lot of people say walleye. Of course, catfish makes sense, but walleye. I was in a Forest Service or conservation cabin in Shannondale, Missouri, at some folk festival thing, I don't even remember anymore, which was across the street. And I went through the cabin and just looking at these old things on the wall, and there were 2 cool things that popped up. One was the history of walleye in the Ozarks. So I'm like, all right, walleye's fair game. That's great because walleye's a great fish. The other one was eel, being native to the area. We've only done eel a couple times at the restaurant because it's super expensive and I can't get it locally. Because we've dammed up all the rivers, and for those of you who aren't eel sex experts, what you don't know is only the females live here. The guys just stay down the Gulf chilling out. And the ladies swim on down and do their thing and then swim back up. Don't quote me on any of that. I'm not an eel expert, but eel. And then the other one, which I think is really interesting, is trout. People are like, well, of course we have trout. We didn't serve trout for 2.5 years, almost 3 years, because I had very clear research that showed trout were introduced in the 1950s as part of the sports fishing movement that swept across the country. And so that's not my timeline, so we don't serve it. We started working with, I'm going to blank on her name, a professor down in Rolla who's the director of the Ozark Research Substation. She came in for dinner. I didn't know who she was, and I say something about trout, and she said, I'm going to email you. Next day, I find out who she is, and her specialty is 19th century Ozark forest fire management, which included the use of goats, which is when I started serving goat at the restaurant. But she said the land that their center is on is documented as an 1890s trout fishery. Oh, interesting. That's a little late for my timeline, but it's enough for me to work it onto the menu so I can tell the story. I have also done some of the basic pond fish, like we did an event at Shaw Nature Reserve, and we did bluegill and all that, but anyone who's cooked those, they're a pain. We're not going to do it again. Now when we get them, we use them to make fish sauce. We don't use the flesh itself.
Okay, mine is about the challenge of what you serve during the winter versus summer, talking about, since you're talking local and availability.
Yeah. So if you were able to catch some of the details on the spreadsheet, that's how we do it. We have to plan ahead. So from late December through mid-March, we are a root vegetable intensive restaurant. And our proteins go up because we generally lean vegetarian. We're not a vegetarian restaurant. Don't be confused by that. There will be flesh on the menu, but we lean vegetable. And oftentimes the only meat is in the entree. So during those cold winter months, we're working through the farmer's supply of squash and root vegetables and nuts. All of a sudden I bring pecans on, black walnuts. Sometimes I get little chinkapin chestnut and and sometimes hickory if I have the gumption to shell them all. So that's how we do it. And like right now I've got pawpaw on the menu. If anyone has harvested pawpaw, you know it's only the last week of August and the first week and a half of September. That's it. Well, I gathered 200 pounds during that 2-week period, and we immediately get the puree, process, strain, get the seeds and skin out, and then backpack it and freeze it. And so I can pull it out. As soon as I'm done here, I'm going back to make a pawpaw creamsicle dessert for Thursday. And so that's how we do it. We're even now, like we barely have anything. The farmers have finally started bringing asparagus, strawberries, and rhubarb. There's other stuff. I see it at the farmer's market, but it's hothouse, and we don't buy hothouse. We only do naturally raised. I'm goofy. I don't know. I'm obsessive that way. But that's how we do it. Just really good planning.
Thank you so much for your time. I'm wondering, do the Ozarks have a history of fermented, brewed, or distilled beverages? And if so, to what extent does your team work to recreate and raise awareness of these kinds of beverages?
Yeah, so the question's about fermentation and alcoholic beverages. Yes, of course, moonshine. And we have a moonshine flight at the restaurant. When people order that, I'm like, are you sure you want that? But they always do. And we've worked with a number of distillers. In fact, I think the one that most people might be familiar with is Wood Hat. They work with farmers who are doing historic varieties of corn to make their bourbon or whiskey. I'll probably get that one wrong, but whatever type they're doing. We don't see documentation of any of that. So this is a more modern thing that I do to let my bar be able to serve something. But the bar is really based on, like I said, 4 inventories: 1837, 1874, 1891, and then Thomas Bullock, who's 1910-ish. Tom Bullock is super famous because he was an African-American bartender at the St. Louis Country Club. He came before from Louisville, and he's actually world famous because he has a cocktail cookbook, whatever you would call that, but a cocktail book from that time, about 1907, that specializes in punches and juleps. He has his own famous version of a mint julep. So we're building the menu off of that. And like the 1837 one only had 7 liquors on it, including Madeira, which would make sense back then, versus 1874, there's hardly any Madeira anymore. It fell out of fashion, and now we see just other stuff, including anisette. And so that's how we do that. It's not been an area that we have put a ton of time in beyond those inventories because I've not seen the possibility of finding something. There's another distiller in the area. I see him, I'm blanking on his name, and he goes around to Ozark communities and getting the old timers family recipes for moonshine. That's pretty cool. I hope that nets a book at some point, but I don't know where he is on that project.
Going back to the squirrels. Some of these animals that we consider wild, are any of them captive bred for food?
It depends what you're asking. For the restaurant, we would only follow the health department's regulations and only purchase from approved sources that are USDA certified. I've gotten in trouble before. There's no one that I know of who's doing domestication of wild animals. Anyone who goes to the Soulard Farmers Market knows there's a guy there who does meats who often will have raccoon or beaver. I don't know how he's doing that, but that's not something a restaurant's going to touch.
Great talk, thank you. I'm wondering if you were influenced or otherwise, inspired by Noma out of Denmark?
Yeah, so Noma, again, in the chronology of restaurants, Noma kind of pops in mid-journey for me. So while I watch what they do, I had already been foraging. I had already been doing contemporary foods. And so I'm looking more domestically at Alinea, who led the way on the contemporary part. And then a good friend of mine is Jeremy Umansky. I don't know if you know that name. He's the one who wrote Koji Alchemy, but he's become one of the big names of fermentation in the US. Jeremy and I have known each other for a long time as foragers before he became Jeremy Umansky. And so I watch what they do, and I think, wow, I can't even imagine having a staff of 30 and 50 stages and interns to do all my work for me. Like, what he's able to do is remarkable. Rene Redzepi, for people who don't know, the chef there. But that's a different type of restaurant, and that type of restaurant doesn't fit with my philosophy on ethics of how I want to run my restaurant. I can't do that kind of work and pay my staff a living wage. Everyone on my team, dishwasher to manager, is the same. We're all $31 an hour with 1 month paid vacation and health insurance, flat. And so, well, sure, you applaud. You don't have to write the paychecks every week. I just did payroll yesterday. But the reason I did that is, you all have heard the stories. People in restaurants, man, that's a lot of hours, and it's grueling physical work. To make $15 an hour, especially for the kitchen folk. I also, though, was thinking ahead to Normandy High School, and when those kids start graduating, and how I know they'll be ready to come work for us. And then what does that do to a kid from Normandy who now makes $31 an hour with a month paid vacation and health insurance? That's pretty cool. But that made a simple question much haughtier than it might need to be. But that's how my brain works on them. I think it's cool. I would love to have eaten their food before they wrapped it up. I can't do that here, and I think it's more than we need to do anyway.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions. I'm going to go right here.
And if I could give shorter answers, you'd have time for a lot more.
I'll try and keep the question short. it's fun and exciting to be at the beginning of something, as I feel you are. Do you ever think about what America's eating habits might look like in, say, 30 or 50 years' time if, you know, your philosophy and others like you spreads and becomes more popular?
I don't know that it will ever spread and be more popular because it's more work and more expensive. I do think a lot about the California movement and the impact that's had on us for, 40 years now? We eat fresher because of Alice Waters. But I think about my work with Allison Miller on wild edibles. And in New Mexico, I used to work with a researcher, Richard Felger from Arizona State. And we were looking at wild grass as food source. My role in all these is, if you bring me the stuff, let me see if I can make it enjoyable to a modern diner. Because like grass seed, historically it would have been gruel. You don't want gruel. I mean, I don't know, with your accent, you like porridge. So, you know, you might like gruel with higher protein levels. But my job is to say, hey, we know about this thing called koji now. What if we do a fermentation with it? Or I have a melanger in my kitchen. It's a stone wheel grinder. What can I do with the melanger? And what does that do to the fatty acids in the seeds? Is that going to make them rancid? Does that damage the nutrient? So we think about these things as these teams. So I don't know. Again, I don't want to get negative here. I'm a nihilist in terms of what I view as happening to the environment. And so I just can control my little universe and hope that it spreads to the people that I impact. And I will give you one story. When we went to COVID, we did something called Park and Dine. You would park on Washington Ave, text me, Smith Family 2, white Corolla. We would start running the tasting menu out to you course by course. Cool idea, because no one wants to carry out boxes that you have to microwave and pay more for, which is what most people did. And that's when we started doing little QR codes that would lead you to a video on YouTube. We still do those today, but not as much as we did back then. One of the stories I always made sure was included is how we're a zero waste restaurant. Literally zero waste. Food never goes in the trash. At worst, it goes to compost, and to us, compost is a failure. Why do I say that? Because 3 years later, 2.5 years later, I had a customer, a couple come in and they said, hey, we've never eaten here, but we did the car thing a bunch of times. And we always would have our kid with us. And at that time he was 4 and he would watch those videos with us. And we just want to tell you that now, if he sees us put food in the trash, he says, Chef Rob would say to not do that. And as annoying as I'm sure that is, how cool is that? So I do have glimmers of hope. I don't know how to make macro change or macro influence. So,
what was the subject of your PhD, and does any of it relate to your current endeavor?
I don't know where I'm looking, but my doctorate is, of course, in sports psychology. That has nothing to do with anything, although I will help you perform much better while you're eating dinner with me.
Unbelievably, that was my question.
Seriously, my degree is in sports psychology.
All right, so that had been my question as well. So to follow that then, where did you get all of the sort of academic, did you get any kind of education that took you down this?
It's okay. I mean, my undergrad's a liberal arts degree from Loyola, and so I'm kind of a generalist in a lot of things, and I'm a shiny things person. I'm constantly chasing what's exciting me right now. I mean, right now, what I'm super excited about is I'm specializing in Taiwanese pastry. That's random. It's because my closest friends are from mainland China or Taiwan, and I'm actually studying 5th century Tang Dynasty. I may have my centuries wrong, but Tang Dynasty origins of dim sum. We think of dim sum as brunch. That's not dim sum. It's the offerings to the gods, these small little things. They were pastry by modern terms, and I'm studying those as a way of learning Mandarin. I'm a shiny things person, and so the nice thing about that doctorate was I learned research skills. And 15 to 16 years of nonprofit management all included a lot of research. That was much more statistical type of research, which I don't use as much, but I sure know how to access information. This ACORN study we're about to do, easy schmeezy. I know how to control my samples and the importance of that. And so, I don't know. I'm a smart guy.
I think you are.
My mom would say, yeah, my mom would say, yeah, he's pretty smart.
Okay, we have one more question. We're going to go right here.
Hi, Chef Rob. I was fortunate enough to be at that Shaw Nature Reserve foraging dinner. In fact, I volunteered my husband to help you with the fish in the kitchen. That was such a nightmare. Anyway, great to be here. I'm wondering, do you ever feel, or have you thought about like how all these invasive species like a Sericea lespedeza is changing your Ozark format, and is there anyone who you could inspire to do something with invasive species at the level you do?
Yeah, we always are talking native and invasive, and people seem to think native good, invasive bad, which ecologically is probably true, but culinarily, they all taste yummy. And the one that we use a lot, because we know it needs to get out, is garlic mustard. There's another chef in town who really has championed that cause, Ryan Maher. He's another foraging chef, and I don't know where he is right now. I think maybe the Last Hotel. But he's always pushed to get rid of that. I work a lot with Crystal Stevens of Bulrush Farms, and she and I talk a lot about natives and invasives. The thing about invasives is I can never serve enough to make an impact. So it's really about the education that I'm able to provide. And I will kind of wrap that question up with a quick story, because it tells, to me, the long-term impact of the work that we do. A few months back, I had a customer come in, and I could just tell that she was a surgeon. No offense to surgeons or doctors, but there's levels of air about you. And she was a surgeon. I knew it. And somewhere near the end of the meal, she said, well, how does it feel to know that all this work and all this research disappears at the end of every night? She caught me on a bad night. And she also didn't know my background. And I said, I don't know. How does it feel to write a journal or an article to go in some arcane journal that no one's going to read just to build your CV? And I hey. So remember, I went to Purdue, where the motto was "Publisher Prairies," which I always thought was funny. Like they thought Oklahoma was worse than Indiana. So I come from a background of the importance in publishing to advance yourself. And I said to her, here's the thing. Every night of my life, I serve 48 people, 7 courses which have 7 stories. And those stories are constantly evolving and growing and changing. And some of it's going to stick. And some of it's going to infiltrate back into their lives, into their circles. And to me, that's really exciting. Natives and invasives are one of those stories I've said from day one, because it's edible. And I'm not going to get rid of them all, but I'm sure going to do my best to serve a lot of them, make them delicious, and educate people about them. So, all right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for your time.